Actions speak louder than words. And today, while we're talking about making children healthier, there's a way you can make it happen. The Royal Children's Hospital Foundation supports research, education and expertise that impacts generations of children. And with generous support from the Good Friday Appeal, together they make this podcast possible. Every single dollar is an investment in healthy children. Search the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation to show your support. Hi, I'm Dr Anthea Rhodes, paediatrician and your host today on the Kids Health Info podcast. On this episode, we're going to be talking about immunisations and particularly what you need to have and why and when during those early years. And to join us to unpack a lot of the questions that parents have, we've got Dr Margie Danchin, paediatrician and immunisation expert. Welcome, Margie.
From the Royal Children's Hospital Melbourne, this is the Kids Health Info podcast.
So today, let's start with just a bit of an overall view of all the immunisations that, are part of the schedule in childhood, when they happen and why.
Yeah, this is a really common question that parents ask us because I think when a parent looks at the schedule initially, it can look quite overwhelming. But in fact, apart from the birth Hep B vaccine, we give vaccines over 8 time points in childhood. So that's at 6 weeks, 4 months and 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 4 years, and then again in high school in year 7 and year 10. So that's the 8 time points. And that protects against more than 12 diseases.
Okay, so lots of diseases all rolled up into that schedule. Can you talk through some of perhaps the ones that parents might have heard of and what exactly it is that we're protecting against? Like what sort of illnesses are we talking about?
Yeah, I think if parents would like a full list of the vaccine schedule, they can go to the Immunise Australia website. But when we think about the vaccines that parents are most familiar with, probably pertussis or whooping cough would come to mind, and that vaccine is a really important one. We actually have to vaccinate at 5 different time points for that, but that protects against really nasty bouts of coughing, and children can get a pneumonia or a chest infection from whooping cough. It's really dangerous in young infants, and so that's also why we recommend the whooping cough vaccine in pregnancy. So mums need to know about that as well. But then again, also those doses in the first year of life.
And other than whooping cough, what sorts of other things might we be protecting against?
A number of the diseases can cause pneumonia, like pneumococcal disease, or meningitis, which is inflammation of the lining around the brain. So again, pneumococcal or meningococcal disease. At 12 months, we give the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, really important. And of course, rotavirus, which is the most common cause of dehydrating gastroenteritis, so diarrhea and vomiting. And that's the drops that we give to babies at 6 weeks and 4 months.
Okay, so lots of things that fortunately we don't see as much as we used to in years gone by because of that immunisation schedule. You mentioned something there, Margie, about pregnancy. So lots of the listeners may have had some vaccines during pregnancy, or perhaps there might be a future pregnancy. What's the role there for protecting babies?
This is really important for parents to understand, because one of the best ways that we can protect infants in those really early first few weeks and months of life is by giving mum a vaccine, and then she produces the antibodies which cross the placenta and then pass into the baby and protect them very early. So whooping cough's really critical, as well as flu. And we're really fortunate now to have a new vaccine in pregnancy against a virus called RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus. And we also can give a passive immunisation, which is actually giving the antibodies directly to the baby at birth as well. So protection against RSV is another really welcome recent addition to the immunisation schedule.
And so you've just mentioned before as well measles. So really, if you're a mum in Melbourne sitting at home with your new baby, how likely is it that you're going to be at risk of your baby catching measles?
Unfortunately, we have seen more and more measles cases in Australia in the last few years. Last year, we saw a 3-fold increase compared to 2024, so over 180 cases, which is really quite astounding in Australia. And already this year so far, up up to May 2026, we've seen 100 cases. So unfortunately, measles is in the community. It's coming in from returned travellers, mostly from our region, from India, Indonesia, Vietnam in particular, Philippines. So parents really need to be aware that in their area, particularly if coverage is low and well below that 95% threshold to stop transmission of measles in the community, that children are at risk. And in fact, also good to know that the government this year is funding a free third measles, mumps, rubella dose for babies who are aged between 6 months and 11 months who are travelling anywhere overseas, but particularly the Asia-Pacific region. So they still have to get those 2 doses at 12 months and 18 months, but that third extra early dose is really critical if you're travelling with a young infant, because measles just spreads so quickly in airports and on planes like we saw with COVID.
Very contagious, spreads quickly, and that's how you can end up with that outbreak.
That's right.
Okay, so we've got some questions from listeners, because there are lots of questions about immunisations, as you know, Margie. So what we're going to do now is read some of those out, and while we've got you here in the hot seat, you can answer them for us. We'll go to
absolutely.
Alicia, our producer, for the first question.
This first question's from Amelie. Amelie wants to know, should we space any of the vaccines out, and why don't we?
We don't recommend spacing the vaccines out. Parents often believe that if you space them out, it won't impact the child's immune system as much. But actually, we give the vaccines on the schedule when children are most vulnerable to these diseases. So as I said before, we're seeing a lot of these diseases, nasty diseases like pneumococcal disease, meningococcal disease in young children under 12 months. So they need to have these vaccines when they are recommended. We give the pneumococcal vaccine at 6 weeks, 4 months and 12 months. We give that meningococcal vaccine at 12 months. That's when children need protection. That's when their immune system responds the best.
So there's lots of scientific basis, if you like, to the timing, and it does, I think, sometimes the parents feel like a lot. But as you say, if you spread it out, then you have longer periods where you're going to be at risk of getting those infections.
And also important, I think, for parents to understand that they say, well, why do you have to give so many doses of the same vaccine? And that's because the immune system needs a couple of nudges to keep producing those antibodies, and also something called immune memory, so that if a child experiences the infection many years after they had the vaccine, they have immune cells in their bone marrow that can whip into shape and quickly produce antibodies because they've been primed before. So that's why sometimes, like, as I said, for the pneumococcal vaccine, there are 3 doses in the schedule. Unfortunately, for the whooping cough vaccine, we have 5 doses in the schedule because the immunity does decrease over time. So we have to keep boosting the immunity in children, infants and children.
So multiple doses is how it's going to work most effectively.
Yeah.
Great. All right, let's have the next question.
This next question's from Erin. Erin wants to know, how can we deal with the side effects?
I think parents need to understand that vaccines are like any other medication. They have side effects. The most common ones are fever or a sore arm, a red arm, even a lump at the injection site. Sometimes we see a red blotchy rash and we have to work out, well, is it allergy or not? But these are really common. For the killed or the inactivated vaccines, these usually occur in the first 1 to 2 days after a vaccine. And parents might not be aware, but for a live vaccine like the measles vaccine, the side effects are actually about 5 to 10 days after the vaccine. So they're a little bit delayed. And again, you can get a bit of a rash, fever, sort of itchy eyes, a measles-like illness, but it's not measles. So we spend a lot of time in clinic explaining to parents about the common side effects and how to treat them. So if your child is miserable with a fever or they're not feeding as well after their vaccines, it's absolutely safe to give them paracetamol.
Excellent. And I think one of the things that's really tricky for parents when they know there might be a side effect is the idea, well, this is optional. And I'm sure you deal with this all the time, Margie, when you're talking with families who might be feeling a bit unsure about a vaccine. They say, well, I've got my child here who's perfectly well.
That's right.
Why should I give them this medication, as you say, which it is like any other sort of medication when there's a risk of a side effect.
That's right. And I think, as I said before, because we haven't had as much experience in the community with these diseases, I think parents forget, why are we vaccinating? I have a well baby, and they think by giving them a vaccine and them experiencing these side effects, and in certain cultural groups, that the child is now actually sick. But in fact, the child's immune system is responding to the vaccine. So that fever is a way of saying the immune system has been nudged and it's producing those protective antibodies. They're going to circulate in the bloodstream, ready to protect the child if they get the infection. So these side effects are normal. And I think we do need to come back and talk about the diseases and remind people why we are vaccinating. They don't need to understand in great detail, but, we see admissions to hospital all the time, every week, every month, of these diseases. And we need parents to understand in that risk-benefit discussion why we are protecting their children against some of these very horrible diseases.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to the next question.
This question's from Samantha, and Samantha wants to know, why do we give babies so many needles at 2 months, 4 months and 6 months?
We're fortunate now in 2026 to have really great technology in the way that we develop vaccines and the way we test them. So it might seem to parents like there are a lot of vaccines on the schedule, but we're fortunate to have combination vaccines. So as I said earlier, for that 6-in-1 vaccine, which includes the whooping cough vaccine, that's fantastic because in years past we had to give some of those vaccines separately, which means multiple doses of the vaccine ingredients, multiple needles. So in fact, we are protecting children against more diseases with fewer needles. So it's 6 weeks and 4 months. There's only 2 needles, 1 in each leg, and then there's those oral drops. So I think if you actually break it down, you realise that there really aren't that many needles. And as I said, we don't give more than 3 vaccines at a time.
Okay, so as you talked about as well before, I think, Margie, that idea that we need multiple doses to actually build the immune system is part of the reason why there's that series of needles, as well as all the collection of diseases that we're trying to cover.
That's right.
Okay, so lots of information there that addresses common questions that parents have. One of the other things we're doing on the podcast is busting myths. So you hear about immunisations and questions from families all the time. If there's one thing you'd like to set the record straight on, what would that be?
I think, building on what we've just talked about, parents often say, there are just too many vaccines given at a particular time point or on the schedule, and it will overwhelm my child's immune system. And this is a really great myth to bust because, in fact, the vaccines that we give, so for example, at 6 weeks, I explained before, that was 2 needles and the oral drops against rotavirus, which protect against diarrhoea and vomiting from rotavirus infection. Those vaccines would use less than 1% of your baby's immune cells or white blood cells to produce the antibodies to protect them should they encounter the disease, less than 1%. So it's a tiny fraction of the immunity that we're actually boosting. So there's no way that we're actually overwhelming their immune system. And we know from the testing in vaccine clinical trials, when we look at babies who receive the vaccines and those who don't, that they can ably respond to the vaccine. So we test the level of the antibodies in the blood. So we actually know that babies' immune systems are robust and strong, and the vaccines are developed so that their immune system can actually respond to them. So the vaccines that we give at any time point, even if we do actually give more than 3 vaccines, sometimes we have to catch up a vaccine or we add the flu vaccine because a child's missed it. Your child and your baby's immune system can absolutely respond to the vaccines that we give them. So
important, I think, to help parents to understand that. So for people listening who might have some more questions or perhaps they have got concerns, where would you direct them for further information?
I would really recommend that parents look at a website called Sharing Knowledge About Immunisation, or SKAI. This was a website that was developed by a number of experts in immunisation, but also communication and social scientists, really tailored to these questions exactly. So if you Google Sky, that will come up, but also here the Melbourne Vaccine Education Centre. And then if parents are looking for more detailed scientific information, perhaps they want to look at some of the clinical trial data on how well the vaccines work or some of the safety data, then I would recommend they look at the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance. So they can Google NCIRS, and there's a number of fact sheets there that will pop up. So you can really tailor your level of inquiry and questions to some of that information that's available on reputable and trustworthy websites.
And that's important, I think, because there's lots out there and it can be hard to know what to trust. So we'll put links in the show notes to those particular websites so parents can go and have a look and get more information. Thank you so much, Margie, for coming on the show today to have a bit of a chat. Lots of things there for parents to help understand why immunisations are so important to protect babies.
Thanks for having me, Anne.
My pleasure.
Information in this podcast is general in nature and is intended to support, not replace, discussions with your doctor or healthcare professional. If you have concerns about your child, please consult your local healthcare professional for individual advice. This podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders. Kids Health Info is funded thanks to the support of the Royal Children's Hospital Good Friday Appeal.